Okay, hello, dear Sangha friends. It's great to see everybody today. I'd like to begin with a forecast, just letting you all know that yes, it is just as hot in the Illinois area as it is in Dallas, even a little bit hotter. So just wanted to provide you all with that information to begin. Second, I would also like to go into the topic of my talk. So today I thought I would talk on deathlessness and touching deathlessness. So death is something that seems to happen to all beings that are born, and it's often a topic that evokes a lot of emotion and potentially fear when we think of our own deaths or the deaths of our loved ones. And yet, in the Buddhist lore, there is this term deathlessness, touching the deathlessness, the deathless dimension, being able to, through our practice of mindfulness, see deeply into the nature of reality and see almost through this concept of death, almost through this concept into this area of deathlessness. So what does that mean, and how can we touch that dimension is something that I would like to explore in this talk. And as I meditated on this topic and thought about it, I discovered that it's not only the Buddha and Thich Nhat Hanh that teach these aspects, that there's many other religious traditions and non-religious traditions that point to this ultimate reality of deathlessness. So the other day, my wife brought home an interesting drink. It's called Liquid Death, and it's a large canned beverage of tasty bubbling water. And on the can it said something to the effect of, drink this beverage and we will murder your thirst. So we will kill your thirst, meaning that your thirst will die and you won't feel thirsty anymore. So I thought, that's great. I'm totally ready to murder my thirst. Let's do this. I'm tired of having to drink water every day, all the time. So I took a drink of the liquid death and I murdered my thirst, and now I will never be thirsty again. Just kidding. So I'm still thirsty. I'm still drinking. So as you can see, my thirst seems to be deathless. This drink promised the death of my thirst, and I'm still drinking. I'm still thirsty. I still need water. So that points to the nature of deathlessness. And again, that was mostly a joke. I can't hear anyone laughing in the room, but I will imagine that everyone is laughing hilariously at every joke that I throw into the Zoom dimension.
Yeah, could you start over? We couldn't hear anything you said over all the laughter.
Really? So on a little bit more serious note, like I said earlier, the topic of death and dying is a very serious topic, and there's a lot of perhaps pain and grief and sorrow that people carry around death and dying. So I don't want this talk or this concept of deathlessness to be a kind of spiritual bypass where we can just kind of smile and say there is no death, and therefore we don't need to grieve and we don't need to feel pain, and if you are feeling pain, then you're doing something wrong. We need to be really present with people who are dying, who are going through difficult times. We need to be present and develop that deep listening and understanding for people who are dealing with difficult grief and unprocessed grief and sorrow. And we need to bring that sense of deathlessness into the sphere for a maybe healing or an opportunity to transform a view that we have. And so this view of death as I am here right now and then I'm going to die, and I turn into something that is nothing. So something becoming nothing is an idea that can cause us a lot of suffering. And the teachings of the Buddha and Thich Nhat Hanh, as well as other paths, kind of seek to refute this view that we have, that from something we become nothing. And even reversing that, when we think of ourselves as being born, we might think of ourselves as we came from nothing and we became something. The Buddha is very clear on saying that both of these views are erroneous and they're not reflective of the true reality, that nothing can come from nothing, and there is something that has been around that is prior to our birth and will exist and continue on after our death. And I almost think of sharing these different views, these different perspectives as a kind of intervention almost. So we can think of someone that is clinging fiercely to this idea that death means that we pass into something, from something being there to nothing being there. And because they cling to this view, it creates a lot of suffering. And perhaps if one person came to them and tried to confront this view, tried to help them change this view, they may not be able to be receptive to it. So it takes almost one of those therapeutic interventions where many of the family members and friends of the person come around and present these views so that the person may be more receptive to transforming, to changing their point of view, to waking up on this matter. So, a final point before I start to present these views from the different religious traditions and non-religious traditions, is that for me, death is a bell of mindfulness. So often a bell of mindfulness is something that causes us to stop, to take a deep breath, that brings us into a state of being really present and curious about what this life is, about how I'm being in the world. Whenever I hear the word death or dying, or even deathlessness, it's often a bell of mindfulness that invites me to pause and take some deep breaths. And I even find myself being even more present after I hear the word death. So I'd like to share these views, these perspectives. And again, none of these is my attempt to give anyone a dogmatic view. I'm not here to present the objective truth that is not open to debate. It's more about taking in these views and contemplating them and asking questions and seeing how they apply to your life, how they apply to your understanding in the moment. And we'll have plenty of time to discuss and confer on all of these views that I'm sharing. So today, after each of these views, I'm going to hold up this bell. We're going to take 3 deep breaths together once you see the bell, and then I'll ring this bell, and we can have a chance to let all of our thinking go and kind of open a space for the next view to come in while listening to the sound of the bell. So we'll start now, just taking 3 deep breaths. Okay. So the first view of deathlessness that I would like to talk about comes from the Christian perspective and talks of Jesus and how Jesus himself was resurrected. But he also talks about how after we die, after we experience death, many of us are resurrected and we experience almost like a second rebirth. And a lot of that centers around the acts and the works that we've done in our lives. And we have this moment of coming to review our lives and see how the works that we've done may continue, or whether or not they will continue. So even just that idea of resurrection, of this sense of going to a different sphere after this life, points to that reality of deathlessness. If there was death, if we simply ended after this earthly life ends, after our bodies cease to hold our consciousness, then what would be the point of talking about the different realms that we could potentially go to after our lives? What would be the point of even discussing continuation? So the fact that Jesus and many other perspectives in the Bible discuss the continuation of our consciousness after life points to one of those aspects of deathlessness. And if you look in the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, which is a gospel that was unearthed, I believe, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the book actually opens with the saying from Jesus, "Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death." So in that moment, it's about interpreting these sayings in such a way that one can see deeply into the nature of reality and see that this idea that we have of death is more of a concept than an accurate conceptualization of what is really going to happen when we die. So those are some examples of the Christian tradition. There's many, many more in that tradition, but I'll go ahead and ring the bell. We can take 3 deep breaths. The second tradition I would like to discuss is the tradition of the ancient Greeks. So you go back to the philosophers Plato, Aristotle, the philosopher Marcus Aurelius, and I was interested when reading about their culture that there was a system of rituals that they would undergo that was not bound by caste or class. So people from the kings to the royalty to the working class to the slaves even would participate in these what were called Eleusinian mysteries. And in it, it said that they began these mysteries by having this understanding that they were mere mortals. And by the end of going through these mysteries, this is from Wikipedia, one line of thought by modern scholars has been said that the mysteries were intended to elevate man above the human sphere into the divine and to assure his redemption by making him a god and so conferring immortality upon him. So these Eleusinian mysteries are a way of going from the human realm to realizing this state of divinity, this state of perhaps godliness, this state in which there is this understanding, this deep understanding of immortality. And so it is interesting to see that people such as Plato and Marcus Aurelius are still being talked about today. Their teachings have still continued on. And so if we have that idea that they've died, it would be kind of erroneous to still keep talking about their teachings, which are still living through and inspiring many people to this day. So we have the Eleusinian mysteries, and another quote paraphrased by Marcus Aurelius is he said, "Among all things, it's important to remember 2 things. One is that everything is impermanent and changing, and 2 is that nothing can touch the soul." So I thought that was an interesting idea that also points to that nature of deathlessness. So that's the ancient Greek mysteries perspective. So let's take 3 deep breaths and listen to a sound of the bell. For the third perspective, I would like to talk about the Tao Te Ching. So Lao Tzu, the philosopher in ancient China, wrote the book, the Tao Te Ching. The legend is that he wrote it just in a few moments towards the end of his life. And it's a book that's still around today that contains a lot of translations and also some very profound insights into the nature of life. And one of the lines that he has in that book says, "The body dies, there is no danger." So the body dies, there is no danger. What does that mean? We can see that at the moment of what we see as death, the body and consciousness seem to detach. And so the body is something that dies. However, if you look deeply, if you've seen maybe some roadkill, there was a time where I was riding my bike and I witnessed I think it was a squirrel that had gotten hit by a car. And I saw, rather than just feeling disgust, I thought I would actually stop and look deeply into that moment. And I noticed that as I was watching, a crow, a vulture, came down and started eating the bird. Again, it's kind of a difficult image to contemplate, but even in that moment where we think that death is happening, there's a lot of life that's happening there as well. That vulture, that bird is gaining sustenance. When we think of a dead body, perhaps there's bugs and perhaps maggots. Again, this could be a disgusting image, but in the swirl of those bugs and maggots, there's a transformation, and there's also like a vibrant life that's happening there in that moment of death. And all of those elements are dissolving and turning into something that will become soil, that will become air, that will become these other elements that will help to support the sphere of life as well. So again, these images can be scary or difficult. There are some Buddhist practices where you go specifically to a charnel ground and you look at this zone of a graveyard of open bodies decaying in order to help us to awaken to our fullest potential and to see that there is this immense life that's happening in these zones, which we see as death as well. So another line from the Tao Te Ching is this chapter 16, which is one of my favorite chapters in the book. It says, "Empty your mind of all thoughts. Let your heart be at peace. Watch the turmoil of beings, but contemplate their return. Each separate being in the universe returns to the common source. Returning to the source is serenity. If you don't realize the source, you stumble in confusion and sorrow. When you realize where you come from, you naturally become tolerant, disinterested, amused, kind-hearted as a grandmother, dignified as a king. Immersed in the wonder of the Tao, you can deal with whatever life brings you, and when death comes, you are ready." So that line implies a kind of merging, a kind of going home, a kind of realization. And I don't think that's something that we have to wait until our death to realize, to start to see into that wonder of the Tao. The Tao is the oneness of all things, which transcends description. And we can touch that in those moments where we're deeply concentrated in our silent meditation. So that was the perspective of the Tao. Let's listen to the sound of the bell and take 3 deep breaths. The next view I would like to present is a view I encountered when reading the author Victor Villaseñor, who wrote a lot about what he learned from his grandmother, who was an indigenous Yaqui Indian native indigenous person living in Mexico. And she had this view that she shared with him from her indigenous tradition, that we are all walking stars, that our true home is in the sky, in the cosmos with the stars. And during this earthly life, we come down to earth to spread our stardust around, to spread our light around to other beings. And then when we die, we take our true place back at home in the cosmos, in the stars. And that's why human beings have 5 points. We have our head, we have our 2 arms, we have our 2 legs, kind of like that image of a 5-pointed star that you can see. That is also in the shape of a human body if you look closely. I really like that image that we are made of stardust. And if you look deeply in terms of actual physics, you can see that and chemistry, you can see that the components that make up our chemistry, our biochemical reality, are actually stardust. We are literally made of stardust. There are other Native American traditions that I've enjoyed that talk about at the time of death, we go up to the Milky Way and we have to walk a path. One of the paths of the Milky Way is a longer path, and then the other path kind of tees off and shortens out. And depending on the works that we've done in this life, we will be able to see clearly to go on that long path towards a, I guess, celestial realm. And we are said to kind of, after someone passes, we are meant to do good works and pray for their continuation on that long path so that they will reach this realm of celestial understanding, something like that. So those are some native indigenous traditions. Let's reflect on those and do a sound of the bell. The final perspective I would like to share before going into the Buddhist lore on this topic, just sharing a few of the Buddhist views, which there are many, is simply the first law of thermodynamics. When you look into this essential law of physics, you can see that the first law of thermodynamics is energy can be neither created nor destroyed. So again, if we have this idea that we are living now, when we die, our life is destroyed or it goes into nothing, or death is it doesn't just have to apply to us, it can apply to all forms of matter, all beings, that something becomes nothing, we see that that breaks the first law of thermodynamics, that energy cannot be destroyed. The energy is not created and it's not destroyed. Very, very, very similar to what the Buddha said about there is no birth, there is no death, looking at life from the ultimate dimension. So deathlessness, nothing is destroyed. There is simply a continuation in some form. So that's something to contemplate. So I'd like to transition now to the Buddhist views. So far, I've presented mostly views that are based on religious factors or adherence to some more, maybe some of those entail a little bit more dogma than others, but essentially I believe these teachings on deathlessness are something that we can look inside and realize for ourselves through the practice of meditation, through the practice of being really present and watching deeply our lives. If you look at the Buddha's life, he, in his aspiration for enlightenment, he went off into the sit under the Bodhi tree to look deeply into the nature of reality for so long that he would discover this ultimate truth, this ultimate reality, something that's imminently available to all of us. And perhaps we haven't realized these same things because we haven't been able to maybe like take some time away from our lives. Perhaps we're simply caught in desire or the quick movement of our society, and we haven't taken the time to sit and look deeply within ourselves and within the nature of reality. So the Buddha taught this, and he also said not to just believe in what he said, but to go in and make it real for yourself. So I'd like to share just a few teachings from Thich Nhat Hanh and the Buddha. So there's a quote from the Buddha. This is paraphrased as well. And he says, for the unawakened ones, it is as if they have never lived. The awakened one does not die. So again, we can think of perhaps the awakened person, and again, this isn't about us looking to others and judging them and saying, this person's unawakened, I'm better than you are. We can see this in our own path of meditation and mindfulness, of developing concentration, of developing presence. We can see that perhaps in our lives, there were times where we were so focused on the future, so caught in desire, that we were running along and we weren't really aware of the beauty and the wonder of life that was around us in each moment. When we have an experience of awakening, when we have an experience of that beauty and wonder of life, we can see deeply into the nature of reality. We can see beyond all our labels and concepts. And with a clear mind, we can have this deep understanding of deathlessness, of the beauty of the present, of the joy that can come, that can be there in the present moment. The stillness, the imperturbability, the constancy that we can experience when we're truly present and when our mind is not in a state where we're constantly chasing around these things that are distracting us and pulling us away. Even if we can touch that for one moment in our lives, that is still a profound and important experience to have. And one might say that the practice of meditation is about lengthening and widening that experience, that deep insight that we're experiencing and understanding, and building that and growing it in our lives. As I said before, the Buddha also noted that there's this teaching of no coming, no going, there's no after, no before, there's no increasing, there's no decreasing, there's no birth, and there's no death. So there's that deathlessness again. I think from one perspective, a lot of the Buddhist teachings are about refuting a lot of our concepts and notions. In order to really penetrate into the nature of nirvana, into the ultimate dimension, we have to let go of all of our concepts and notions. None of our thoughts or our concepts or our notions is going to be able to fully capture reality. So even though I'm sharing all of these words and concepts and ideas with you today, the goal is to kind of go beyond them in your practice and not to cling to any of these words, but to use them as a means to see deeply into the nature of what I'm trying to say. Around the time of Thich Nhat Hanh's passing back in 2021, I think it was 2021 or 2022, I encountered this quote of his that I liked a lot and that I've reflected on a lot, especially when doing walking meditation. Thich Nhat Hanh said, "My feet touch deathlessness, and my feet are yours." My feet touch deathlessness, and my feet are yours. Thich Nhat Hanh has transmitted many things to us, and when we transmit something to another, we're sharing a type of energy with someone that potentially can outlast our own earthly life. When I am a father and I look at my daughter and I look at the way that she mimics a lot of what I do, and I see that in the way that we're interacting with others, there's this kind of transmission of energy from me to her. Even if we don't have kids, we can see with our friends, with our coworkers, with our relationships in our life, there's still this kind of transmission. We can transmit our smile, we can transmit our peace. Perhaps if we are struggling and going through a difficult time, we may transmit things like anger or fear or grief. And it's important to just be really aware of what we're transmitting in our lives, because we can see that as our continuation as well. So I'd like to close with two components and then perhaps a contemplation. This whole thing has been a contemplation, really. Thich Nhat Hanh has the teaching of the historical and ultimate dimensions, which can help us point to that nature of deathlessness. And he often conveyed this in a really simple metaphor of the wave. So if you picture a wave that's flowing in the ocean, cresting, peaking, and then going down, and you can imagine that this wave thinks that it's a separate self, that it exists on its own. And so therefore, because of that, it has this fear of dying. The wave crests and then goes down, and then the moment that it hits the shore, it dies. However, in reality, the wave is made of water. It has to realize that it is part of the ocean. The wave is water, and the water and the ocean has that nature of deathlessness. You can see the waves crashing on the shore, but in reality, the wave does not end. It simply turns back and becomes this vastness of the water. So that is known as the historical dimension, where we think that we are one wave, one person, one being, separate from reality. Then there's the ultimate dimension that we can get in touch with through the practice of mindfulness, where we touch into our oceanic nature, our vast nature, the nature of nirvana, the nature that defies labels and concepts. This is something that we can continue to contemplate and meditate on for a long time. So I'd like to close with a poem by Thich Nhat Hanh that's related to this. This is one of my favorite poems of Thich Nhat Hanh, and it's called Bhumi Sparsha. And here it is. Death comes with his impressive scythe and says, "You should be afraid of me." I look up and ask, "Why should I be afraid of you?" "Because I will make you dead. I will make you non-existent." "How can you make me non-existent?" Death does not answer. He swings his impressive scythe. I say, "I come and I go. Then I come again, and I go again. I always come back. You can neither make me exist nor non-exist." "How do you know you will come again?" Death asks. I know because I have done that countless times, I say. How do I know that you are telling the truth? Who can be the witness? Death frowns. I touch the earth and say, Earth is the witness. She is my mother. Suddenly, death hears the music. Suddenly, death hears the birds singing from all directions. Suddenly, death sees the trees blossoming. Earth makes herself apparent to death and smiles lovingly to him. Death melts in the loving gaze of earth. Oh, my beloved, touch earth every time you get scared. Touch her deeply and your sorrow will melt away. Touch her deeply and you will touch the deathless. So, I really enjoy that poem, Death Melting in Earth's Loving Gaze. We can consider that deathlessness means that matter continues on, our energy continues on, and we can use that to think of ourselves and think of what energies do we want to continue on through our life. What are things that we want to transmit to our loved ones, to our friends, to strangers, to people who are in need in our life? I think there's many extremely helpful practices that we do every Sunday in the Dallas Meditation Center, such as the 4 Brahma Viharas, to kind of point to some elements that I know that I feel inspired by and that I would really love to continue to practice and cultivate transmitting these things, such as loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. So thank you all for listening. I will close with one more sound of the bell. Let's take 3 deep breaths. Thank you all for your presence. Thank you for listening. I'd like to open it up for discussion now.